Chapter 4. How Intentionality Came into Focus. The Tower of Generate and Test. In order to see farther ahead in time, it helps to see farther into space. What began as internal and peripheral monitoring systems slowly evolved into systems that were capable of not just proximal, neighboring, but distant discrimination. This is where perception comes into its own. The sense of smell, or olfaction, relies on the wafting from afar of harbinger keys to local locks. The trajectories of these harbingers are relatively slow, variable, and uncertain because of random dispersal and evaporation. Thus, information about the source they emanate from is limited. Hearing depends on sound waves striking the system's transducers, and because the paths of sound waves are swifter and more regular, perception can come closer to approximating action at a distance. But sound waves can deflect and bounce in ways that obscure their source. Vision depends on the much swifter arrival of photons bounced off the things in the world, on definitively straight-line trajectories, so that with a suitably shaped pinhole and optional lens arrangement, an organism can obtain instantaneous, high-fidelity information about events and surfaces far away. How did this transition from internal to proximal to distal intentionality take place? Evolution created armies of specialized internal agents to receive the information available at the peripheries of the body. There is just as much information encoded in the light that falls on a pine tree as there is in the light that falls on a squirrel. But the squirrel is equipped with millions of information-seeking microagents specifically designed to take in and even to seek out and interpret this information. Animals are not just herbivores or carnivores. They are, in the nice coinage of the psychologist George Miller, informivores. And they get their epistemic hunger from the combination in exquisite organization of the specific epistemic hungers of millions of microagents, organized into dozens or hundreds or thousands of subsystems. Each of these tiny agents can be conceived of as an utterly minimal intentional system, whose life project is to ask a single question over and over and over. Is my message coming in now? Is my message coming in now? And springing into limited but appropriate action whenever the answer is yes. Without the epistemic hunger, there is no perception, no uptake. Philosophers have often attempted to analyze perception into the given and what is then done with the given by the mind. The given is, of course, taken, but the taking of the given is not something done by one master taker located in some central headquarters of the animal's brain. The task of taking is distributed among all the individually organized takers. The takers are not just the peripheral transducers, the rods and cones on the retina of the eye, the specialized cells in the epithelium of the nose, but also all the internal functionaries fed by them, cells and groups of cells connected in networks throughout the brain. They are fed not patterns of light or pressure, the pressure of sound waves and of touch, but patterns of neuronal impulses. But aside from the change of diet, they are playing similar roles. How do all these agents get organized into larger systems capable of sustaining ever more sophisticated sorts of intentionality? By a process of evolution by natural selection, of course, but not just one process. I want to propose a framework in which we can place the various design options for brains to see where their power comes from. It is an outrageously oversimplified structure, but idealization is the price one should often be willing to pay for synoptic insight. I call it the Tower of Generate and Test. As each new floor of the tower gets constructed, it empowers the organisms at that level to find better and better moves and find them more efficiently. In the beginning, there was Darwinian evolution of species by natural selection. A variety of candidate organisms were blindly generated by more or less arbitrary processes of recombination and mutation of genes. These organisms were field-tested, and only the best designs survived. This is the ground floor of the tower. Let us call its inhabitants Darwinian creatures. This process went through many millions of cycles, producing many wonderful designs, both plant and animal. Eventually, among its novel creations were some designs with the property of phenotypic plasticity. That is, the individual candidate organisms were not wholly designed at birth. There were elements of their design that could be adjusted by events that occurred during the field tests. Some of these candidates, we may suppose, were no better off than their cousins, the hardwired Darwinian creatures, since they had no way of favoring, selecting for an encore, the behavioral options they were equipped to try out. But others, we may suppose, were fortunate enough to have wired-in reinforcers that happened to favor smart moves. That is, actions that were better for the candidates than the available alternative actions. These individuals thus confronted the environment by generating a variety of actions, which they tried out one by one until they found one that worked. They detected that it worked only by getting a positive or negative signal from the environment, which adjusted the probability of that action's being reproduced on another occasion. Any creatures wired up wrong, with positive and negative reinforcement reversed, would be doomed, of course. Only those fortunate enough to be born with appropriate reinforcers would have an advantage. We may call this subset of Darwinian creatures Skinnerian creatures, since, as the behaviorist psychologist B.F. Skinner was fond of pointing out, such operant conditioning is not just analogous to Darwinian natural selection, it is an extension of it. In his 1953 book, Science and Human Behavior, Skinner wrote, "Where inherited behavior leaves off, the inherited modifiability of the process of conditioning takes over." Skinnerian conditioning is a good thing, as long as you are not killed by one of your early errors. A better system involves pre-selection among all the possible behaviors or actions, so that the truly stupid moves are weeded out before they're hazarded in real life. We human beings are creatures capable of this particular refinement, but we are not alone. We may call the beneficiaries of this third floor in the tower Popperian creatures, since, as the philosopher Sir Karl Popper once elegantly put it, this design enhancement permits our hypotheses to die in our stead. Unlike the merely Skinnerian creatures, many of whom survive only because they make lucky first moves, Popperian creatures survive because they're smart enough to make better-than-chance first moves. Of course, they're just lucky to be smart, but that's better than being just lucky. How is this pre-selection in Popperian agents to be done? There must be a filter, and any such filter must amount to a sort of inner environment in which tryouts can be safely executed, an inner something or other structured in such a way that the surrogate actions it favors are more often than not the very actions the real world would also bless if they were actually performed. In short, the inner environment, whatever it is, must contain lots of information about the outer environment and its regularities. Nothing else, except magic, could provide pre-selection worth having. One could always flip a coin or consult an oracle, but this is no improvement over blind trial and error unless the coin or oracle is systematically biased by someone or something that has true information about the world. The beauty of Popper's idea is exemplified in the recent development of realistic flight simulators used for training airplane pilots. In a simulated world, pilots can learn which moves to execute in which crises without ever risking their lives or expensive airplanes. As examples of the Popperian trick, however, flight simulators are in one regard misleading. They reproduce the real world too literally. We must be very careful not to think of the inner environment of a Popperian creature as simply a replica of the outer world, with all the physical contingencies of that world reproduced. In such a miraculous toy world, the little hot stove in your head would be hot enough to actually burn the little finger in your head that you placed on it. Nothing of the sort needs to be supposed. The information about the effect of putting a finger on the stove has to be in there, and it has to be in there in a form that can produce its premonitory effect when called upon in an internal trial. But this effect can be achieved without constructing a replica world. After all, it would be equally Popperian to educate pilots just by having them read a book that explained to them all the contingencies they might encounter when they eventually climbed into the cockpit. It might not be as powerful a method of learning, but it would be hugely better than trial and error in the sky. The common element in Popperian creatures is that one way or another, either by inheritance or by acquisition, information is installed in them, accurate information about the world that they probably will encounter. And this information is in such a form that it can achieve the preselective effects that are its raison d'etre. One of the ways Popperian creatures achieve useful filtering is by putting candidate behavioral options before the bodily tribunal and exploiting the wisdom, however out of date or short-sighted, accumulated in those tissues. If the body rebels, for example, in such typical reactions as nausea, vertigo, or fear and trembling, this is a semi-reliable sign, better than a coin flip, that the contemplated act might not be a good idea. Here we see that rather than rewiring the brain to eliminate these choices, making them strictly unthinkable, evolution may simply arrange to respond to any thinking of them with a negative rush so strong as to make them highly unlikely to win the competition for execution. The information in the body that grounds the reaction may have been placed there either by genetic recipe or by recent individual experience. When a human infant first learns to crawl, it has an innate aversion to venturing out onto a pane of supportive glass through which it can see a visual cliff. Even though its mother beckons it from a few feet away, cajoling and encouraging, the infant hangs back fearfully, despite never having suffered a fall in its life. The experience of its ancestors is making it err on the side of safety. When a rat has eaten a new kind of food and has then been injected with a drug that causes it to vomit, it will subsequently show a strong aversion to food that smells like the food it ate just before vomiting. Here the information leading it to err on the side of safety was obtained from its own experience. Neither filter is perfect. After all, the pane of glass is actually safe, and the rat's new food is actually non-toxic. But better safe than sorry. Clever experiments by psychologists and ethologists suggest other ways in which animals can try actions out in their heads and thereby reap a Popperian benefit. In the 1930s and 1940s, behaviorists demonstrated to themselves time and again that their experimental animals were capable of latent learning about the world, learning that was not specifically rewarded by any detectable reinforcement. Their exercise in self-refutation is itself a prime example of another Popperian theme, that science makes progress only when it poses refutable hypotheses. If left to explore a maze in which no food or other reward was present, rats would simply learn their way around in the normal course of things. Then, if something they valued was introduced into the maze, the rats that had learned their way around on earlier forays were much better at finding it, not surprisingly, than the rats in the control group, which were seeing the maze for the first time. This may seem a paltry discovery. Wasn't it always obvious that rats were smart enough to learn their way around? Yes and no. It may have seemed obvious, but this is just the sort of testing against the background of the null hypothesis, that must be conducted if we're going to be sure just how intelligent, how mindful various species are. Other experiments with animals demonstrate surprisingly stupid streaks, almost unbelievable gaps in the animal's knowledge of their own environments. The behaviorists tried valiantly to accommodate latent learning into their conditioning models. One of their most telling stopgaps was to postulate a curiosity drive, which was satisfied, or reduced, as they said, by exploration. There was reinforcement going on, after all, in those non-reinforcing environments. Every environment, marvelous to say, is full of reinforcing stimuli simply by being an environment in which there is something to learn. As an attempt to save orthodox behaviorism, this move was manifestly vacuous, but that does not make it a hopeless idea in other contexts. It acknowledges the fact that curiosity, epistemic hunger, must drive any powerful learning system. We human beings are conditionable by behavioristic training, so we are Skinnerian creatures. But we are not just Skinnerian creatures. We also enjoy the benefits of much genetically inherited hard wiring, so we are Darwinian creatures as well. But we are more than that. We are Popperian creatures. Which other animals are Popperian creatures, and which are merely Skinnerian? Pigeons were Skinner's favorite experimental animals. and he and his followers developed the technology of operant conditioning to a very sophisticated level, getting pigeons to exhibit remarkably bizarre and sophisticated learned behaviors. Notoriously, the Skinnerians never succeeded in proving that pigeons were not pauparian creatures, and research on a host of different species, from octopuses to fish to mammals, strongly suggests that if there are any purely Skinnerian creatures capable only of blind trial-and-error learning, they are to be found among the simple invertebrates. The huge sea slug or sea hare, Aplysia californica, has more or less replaced the pigeon as the focus of attention among those who study the mechanism of simple conditioning. We do not differ from all other species in being pauparian creatures, then. Far from it. Mammals and birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and even many invertebrates exhibit the capacity to use general information they obtain from their environments to pre-sort their behavioral options before striking out. How does the new information about the outer environment get incorporated into their brains? By perception, obviously. The environment contains an embarrassment of riches, much more information than even a cognitive angel could use. Perceptual mechanisms designed to ignore most of the flux of stimuli concentrate on the most useful, most reliable information. And how does the information gathered manage to exert its selective effect when the options are considered, helping the animal design ever more effective interactions with its world? There are no doubt a variety of different mechanisms and methods, but among them are those that use the body as a sounding board. The search for sentience. We have been gradually adding elements to our recipe for a mind. Do we have the ingredients for sentience yet? Certainly the normal behavior of many of the animals we've been describing passes our intuitive tests for sentience with flying colors. Watching a puppy or a baby tremble with fear at the edge of an apparent precipice, or a rat grimacing in apparent disgust at the odor of supposedly toxic food, we have difficulty even entertaining the hypothesis that we are not witnessing a sentient being. But we have also uncovered substantial grounds for caution. We have seen some ways in which surprisingly mind-like behavior can be produced by relatively simple, mechanical, apparently unmind-like control systems. The potency of our instinctual responses to sheer speed and lifelikeness of motion, for instance, should alert us to the genuine, not merely philosophical, possibility that we can be fooled into attributing more subtlety, more understanding to an entity than the circumstances warrant. Recognizing that observable behavior can enchant us, we can appreciate the need to ask further questions about what lies behind that behavior. Consider pain. In 1986, the British government amended its laws protecting animals in experiments, adding the octopus to the privileged circle of animals that may not be operated upon without anesthesia. An octopus is a mollusk, physiologically more like an oyster than a trout, let alone a mammal. But the behavior of the octopus and the other cephalopods, squid, cuttlefish, is so strikingly intelligent and, apparently, sentient, that the scientific authorities decided to let behavioral similarity override internal difference. Cephalopods, but not other mollusks, are officially presumed to be capable of feeling pain, just in case they are. Rhesus monkeys, in contrast, are physiologically and evolutionarily very close to us, so we tend to assume that they are capable of suffering the way we do. But they exhibit astonishingly different behavior on occasion. The primatologist Mark Hauser has told me in conversation that during mating season the male monkeys fight ferociously, and it is not uncommon to see one male pin another down and then bite and rip out one of its testicles. The injured male does not shriek or make a facial expression, but simply licks the wound and walks away. A day or two later, the wounded animal may be observed mating. It is hard to believe that this animal was experiencing anything like the agonies of a human being similarly afflicted. The mind reels to think of it, in spite of our biological kinship. So we can no longer hope that the physiological and behavioral evidence will happily converge to give us unequivocal answers, since we already know cases in which these two sorts of compelling, if inconclusive, evidence pull in opposite directions. How, then, can we think about this issue? A key function of pain is negative reinforcement, the punishment that diminishes the likelihood of a repeat performance. And any Skinnerian creature can be trained by negative reinforcement of one sort or another. Is all such negative reinforcement pain? Experienced pain? Could there be unconscious or unexperienced pain? There are simple mechanisms of negative reinforcement that provide the behavior shaping or pruning power of pain with apparently no further mind-like effects, so it would be a mistake to invoke sentience wherever we find Skinnerian conditioning. Another function of pain is to disrupt normal patterns of bodily activity that might exacerbate an injury. Pain causes an animal to protect an injured limb until it can mend, for instance, and this is normally accomplished by a flood of neurochemicals in a self-sustaining loop of interaction with the nervous system. Does the presence of those substances then guarantee the occurrence of pain? No, for in themselves they are just keys floating around in search of their locks. If the cycle of interaction is interrupted, there's no reason at all to suppose that pain persists. Are these particular substances even necessary for pain? Might there be creatures with a different system of locks and keys? The answers may depend more on historical processes of evolution on this planet than on any intrinsic properties of the substances. The example of the octopus shows that we should look to see what variations in chemical implementation are to be found, with what differences in function, but without expecting these facts in themselves to settle our questions about sentience. What then about the other features of this cycle of interaction? How rudimentary might a pain system be and still count as sentience? What would be relevant and why? Consider, for instance, a toad with a broken leg. Is this a sentient being experiencing pain? It is a living being whose normal life has been disrupted by damage to one of its parts, preventing it from engaging in the behaviors that are its way of earning a living. It is, moreover, in a state with powerful negative reinforcement potential. It can readily be conditioned to avoid such states of its nervous system. This state is maintained by a cycle of interaction that somewhat disrupts its normal dispositions to leap, though in an emergency it will leap anyway. It is tempting to see all this as amounting to pain, but it is also tempting to endow the toad with a soliloquy in which it dreads the prospect of such an emergency, yearns for relief, deplores its relative vulnerability, bitterly regrets the foolish actions that led it to this crisis, and so forth. And these further accompaniments are not in any way licensed by anything we know about toads. On the contrary, the more we learn about toads, the more confident we are becoming that their nervous systems are designed to carry them through life without any such expensive reflective capacities. So what? What does sentience have to do with such fancy intellectual talents? A good question, but that means we must try to answer it and not just use it as a rhetorical question to deflect inquiry. Here is a circumstance in which how we ask the questions can make a huge difference, for it is possible to bamboozle ourselves into creating a phantom problem at this point. How? By losing track of where we stand in a process of addition and subtraction. At the outset, we are searching for X, the special ingredient that distinguishes mere sensitivity from true sentience, and we work on the project from two directions. Working up from simple cases, adding rudimentary versions of each separate feature, we tend to be unimpressed. Though each of these powers is arguably an essential component of sentience, there is surely more to sentience than that. A mere robot could well exhibit that without any sentience at all. Working down from our own richly detailed and richly appreciated experience, we recognize that other creatures manifestly lack some of the particularly human features of our experience, so we subtract them as inessential. We don't want to be unfair to our animal cousins. So while we recognize that much of what we think of when we think of the awfulness of pain, and why it matters morally whether someone is in pain, involves imagining just these anthropomorphic accompaniments, we generously decide that they are just accompaniments, not essential to the brute phenomenon of sentience, and its morally most significant instance, pain. What we may tend to overlook as these two ships pass in the night is the possibility that we are subtracting on the one path the very thing we are seeking on the other. If that's what we're doing, Our conviction that we have yet to come across X, the missing link of sentience, would be a self-induced illusion. I don't say that we are making an error of this sort, but just that we might well be doing so. That's enough for the moment, since it shifts the burden of proof. Here, then, is a conservative hypothesis about the problem of sentience. There is no such extra phenomenon. Sentience comes in every imaginable grade or intensity, from the simplest and most robotic to the most exquisitely sensitive, hyperreactive human. As we saw in Chapter 1, we do indeed have to draw lines across this multi-stranded continuum of cases, because having moral policies requires it. But the prospect that we will discover a threshold, a morally significant step in what is otherwise a ramp, is not only extremely unlikely, but morally unappealing as well. Consider the toad once again in this regard. On which side of the line does the toad fall? If toads are too obvious a case for you, one way or the other, choose whatever creature seems to occupy the gray area of your own uncertainty. Choose an ant, or a jellyfish, or a pigeon, or a rat. Now suppose that science confirms that there is minimal genuine sentience in the toad, that a toad's pain is real experienced pain, for instance. The toad now qualifies for the special treatment reserved for the sentient. Now suppose instead that the toad turns out not to have X once we have determined what X is. In this case, the toad's status falls to mere automaton, something that we may interfere with in any imaginable way with no moral compunction whatever. Given what we already know about toads, does it seem plausible that there could be some heretofore unimagined feature, the discovery of which could justify this enormous difference in our attitude? Of course, if we discovered that toads were really tiny human beings trapped in toad bodies, like the prince in the fairy tale, we would immediately have grounds for the utmost solicitude, for we would know that in spite of all behavioral appearances, toads were capable of enduring all the tortures and anxieties we consider so important in our own cases. But we already know that a toad is no such thing. We are being asked to imagine that there is some X that is nothing at all like being a human prince trapped in a toad skin, but is nevertheless morally compelling. We also already know, however, that a toad is not a simple wind-up toy, but rather an exquisitely complex living thing capable of a staggering variety of self-protective activities in the furtherance of its preordained task of making more generations of toads. Isn't that already enough to warrant some special regard on our part? We are being asked to imagine that there is some X that is nothing at all like this mere sophistication of control structure, but that nevertheless would command our moral appreciation when we discovered it. We are being asked, I suspect, to indulge in something beyond fantasy. But let us continue with our search to see what comes next, for we are still a long way from human minds. From phototaxis to metaphysics. Once we get to pauperian creatures, creatures whose brains have the potential to be endowed in inner environments with pre-selective prowess, what happens next? Many different things, no doubt, but we will concentrate on one particular innovation whose powers we can clearly see. Among the successors to mere pauperian creatures are those whose inner environments are informed by the designed portions of the outer environment. One of Darwin's fundamental insights is that design is expensive, but copying designs is cheap. That is, making an all-new design is very difficult, but redesigning old designs is relatively easy. Few of us could reinvent the wheel, but we don't have to, since we acquired the wheel design, and a huge variety of others, from the cultures we grew up in. We may call this subset of Darwinian creatures Gregorian creatures, since the British psychologist Richard Gregory is, to my mind, the preeminent theorist of the role of information, or more exactly what Gregory calls potential intelligence, in the creation of smart moves, or what Gregory calls kinetic intelligence. Gregory observes in his 1981 book, Mind and Science, that a pair of scissors, as a well-designed artifact, is not just a result of intelligence, but an endower of intelligence, external potential intelligence, in a very straightforward and intuitive sense. When you give someone a pair of scissors, you enhance their potential to arrive more safely and swiftly at smart moves. Anthropologists have long recognized that the advent of tool use accompanied a major increase in intelligence. Chimpanzees in the wild go after termites by thrusting crudely prepared fishing sticks deep into the termites' underground homes and swiftly drawing up a stick full of termites, which they then strip off the stick into their mouths. This fact takes on further significance when we learn that not all chimpanzees have hit upon this trick. In some chimpanzee cultures, termites are an unexploited food source. This reminds us that tool use is a two-way sign of intelligence. Not only does it require intelligence to recognize and maintain a tool, let alone fabricate one, but a tool confers intelligence on those lucky enough to be given one. The better designed the tool, the more information there is embedded in its fabrication, the more potential intelligence it confers on its user. And among the preeminent tools, Gregory reminds us, are what he calls mind tools, words. Words and other mind tools give a Gregorian creature an inner environment that permits it to construct ever more subtle move generators and move testers. Skinnerian creatures ask themselves, what do I do next? And haven't a clue how to answer until they've taken some hard knocks. Popperian creatures make a big advance by asking themselves, what should I think about next? Before they ask themselves, what should I do next? Gregorian creatures take a big step toward a human level of mental adroitness, benefiting from the experience of others by exploiting the wisdom embodied in the mind tools that those others have invented, improved, and transmitted. Thereby, they learn how to think better about what they should think about next, and so forth, creating a tower of further internal reflections with no fixed or discernible limit. How this step to the Gregorian level might be accomplished can best be seen by backing up and looking at the ancestral talents from which these most human mental talents must be constructed. One of the simplest life-enhancing practices found in many species is phototaxis, distinguishing light from dark and heading for the light. Light is easily transduced, and given the way light emanates from a source, its intensity diminishing gradually as you get farther away, quite a simple connection between transducers and effectors can produce reliable phototaxis. In the neuroscientist Valentino Breitenberg's elegant little book Vehicles, we get the simplest model, a truck with two powered wheels, the effectors, one either side of the truck on a single axle but each with an independent motor. The truck has two light transducers, eyes, at the front, and their variable output signals are fed to two motors but crossed over. The more light transduced, the faster the motor runs. The transducer nearer the light source will drive its motor a bit faster than the transducer farther from the light, and this will always turn the vehicle in the direction of the light, till eventually it hits the light source itself or orbits tightly around it. The world of such a simple being is graded from light to not so light to dark, and it traverses the gradient. It knows and needs to know nothing else. Light recognition is almost for free. Whatever turns on the transducer is light, and the system doesn't care whether it's the very same light that is returned or a new light. In a world with two moons, it might make a difference, ecologically, which moon you were tracking. Moon recognition or identification could be an additional problem that needed a solution. Mere phototaxis would not be enough in such a world. In our world, a moon is not the sort of object that typically needs re-identifying by a creature. Mothers, in contrast, often are. Homing in on mother, we might call this mama-taxis, is a considerably more sophisticated talent. If mama emitted a bright light, phototaxis might do the job, but not if there were other mothers in the vicinity all using the same system. If mama then emitted a particular blue light, different from the light emitted by every other mother, then putting a particular everything but blue filter on each of your phototransducers would do the job quite well. Nature often relies on a similar principle, but using a more energy-efficient medium. Mama emits a signature odor, distinguishably different from all other odors in the immediate vicinity. Mama-taxis, now defined as mother re-identification and homing, is then accomplished by odor transduction or olfaction. The intensity of odors is a function of the concentration of the molecular keys as they diffuse through the surrounding medium, air or water. A transducer can therefore be an appropriately shaped lock, and can follow the gradient of concentration. Such olfactory signatures are ancient and potent. They have been overlaid in our species by thousands of other mechanisms, but their position in the foundation is still discernible. In spite of all our sophistication, odors move us without our knowing why or how, as Marcel Proust and his Madeleine famously exemplify. Technology honors the same design principle in yet another medium, the EPIRB, Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, a self-contained, battery-powered radio transmitter that repeats over and over again a particular signature at a particular frequency. You can buy one in a marine hardware store and take it with you on your sailboat. Then if you ever get in distress, you turn it on. Immediately, a worldwide tracking system senses your EPIRB's signal and indicates its position with a blip on an electronic map. It also looks up the signature in its giant table of signatures and thereby identifies your boat. Identification greatly simplifies search and rescue, since it adds redundancy. The beacon can be homed in on blindly by radio receivers, transducers, but as the rescuers get close, it helps if they know whether they are looking with their eyes for a black fishing trawler, a small dark green sailboat, or a bright orange rubber raft. Other sensory systems can be brought in to make the final approach swifter and less vulnerable to interruption, should the EPIRB's battery run down, for instance. In animals, odor tracking is not the only medium of mammotaxis. Visual and auditory signals are also relied on, as the ethologist Konrad Lorenz has notably demonstrated in his pioneering studies of imprinting in young geese and ducks. Chicks that are not imprinted shortly after birth with a proper mama signature will fix on the first large moving thing they see and thereafter treat it as mama. Beacons, and their complement of beacon sensors, are good design solutions whenever one agent needs to track, recognize, re-identify a particular entity for a long time. You just install the beacon in the target in advance and then let it roam. But there are costs as usual. One of the most obvious is that friend and foe alike can use the tracking machinery to home in on the target. Predators are typically tuned to the same A low-energy way of achieving a more selective beacon effect would be to put a particular blue spot, pigment of one sort or another, on mama, and let the reflected light of the sun create a beacon visible only in particular sectors of the world and readily extinguished by mamas simply moving into the shadows. The offspring can then follow the blue spot whenever it is visible. But this setup requires an investment in more sophisticated photosensitive machinery, a simple eye, for instance, not just a pair of photocells. The ability to stay in reliably close contact with one particular ecologically very important thing, such as mama, does not require the ability to conceive of this thing as an enduring particular entity, coming and going. As we have just seen, reliable mammotaxis can be achieved with a bag of simple tricks. The talent is normally robust in simple environments, but a creature armed with such a simple system is easily fooled, and when it is fooled, it trundles to its misfortune without any appreciation of its folly. There need be no capability for the system to monitor its own success or reflect on the conditions under which it succeeds or fails. That's a later and expensive add-on. It is important to recognize that this variety of tracking does not require categorization of the target. Think of a primitive eye consisting of an array of a few hundred photocells, transducing a changed pattern of pixels, which are turned on by whatever is reflecting light on them. Such a system could readily deliver a message of the following sort. X, the whatever it is responsible for the pixel clump currently under investigation, has just dodged to the right. Of course, it need not deliver this message in so many words. There need be no words, no symbols. The only identification such a system engages in is the degenerate or minimal sort of moment-to-moment re-identification of the something or other being tracked. Even here, there is tolerance for change and substitution. A gradually changing clump of pixels moving against a more or less static background can change its shape and internal character radically and still be trackable, as long as it doesn't change too fast. What happens when X temporarily goes behind a tree? The simple-minded solution is to keep the most recent version of the search image intact and then just scan around at random, hoping to lock back onto this temporary beacon once again when it emerges, if it ever does. You can improve the odds by aiming your search image at the likeliest spot for the reappearance. And you can get a better than a coin flip idea of the likeliest spot just by sampling the old trajectory of the beacon and plotting its future continuation in a straight line. This yields instances of producing future in one of its simplest and most ubiquitous forms, and also gives us a clear case of the arrow of intentionality poised on a non-existent but reasonably hoped-for target. This ability to keep in touch with another object, literally touching and manipulating it if possible, is the prerequisite for high-quality perception. Visual recognition of a particular person or object, for instance, is almost impossible if the image of the object is not kept centered on the high-resolution fovea of the eye for an appreciable length of time. It takes time for all the epistemically hungry microagents to do their feeding and get organized. So the ability to maintain such a focus of information about a particular thing, whatever it is I'm visually tracking right now, is a precondition for developing an identifying description of the thing. The way to maximize the likelihood of maintaining or restoring contact with an entity being tracked is to rely on multiple independent systems, each fallible but with overlapping domains of competence. Where one system lets down the side, the others take over, and the result tends to be smooth and continuous tracking composed of intermittently functioning elements. So far, I've been asking you to consider relatively simple tasks and systems so that you will appreciate how much cleverness can be built into an intentional system without its having any need for an inner life of reflection or consciousness. Now that we have built the base, we can move on to tackle more complex operations. We can begin to think about thinking. 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 Thinking.